Welcome to today's talk. My name is Professor Joseph Giacomin, and today I'm going to discuss a topic, a tool, which gets used very frequently in designs, very commonly used tool, and that's the tool called scenarios. So what is a scenario? Scenario is, the word scenario is a term borrowed from the world of stage and theater. It's about a sequence of actions, a location, a scene, if we wish, where something happens and there's a self-contained set of events which have a start and a development and some end to it. So scenarios borrowed from the world of performance theater, and it's about some place, sometime, with a group of people, something happens. In commercial settings, this someplace, sometime, things happen is usually referring to some interaction or some sequence of events or some sort of situation in which something we're designing is being encountered by the public or by the users or by some of the stakeholders, and something's occurring and we need to design it to work well in that situation. It's a contextualized description. Good scenarios, useful scenarios, efficient scenarios always have some information about the time, the location, the goals, the plans, and quite often the typical reaction, psychological, emotional of the people involved in that particular interaction. Scenario elements. Over the years, scenarios have been analyzed. There's so many of them. They're being used for so many different purposes, but there are some commonalities and there are some characteristics which you tend to find in most of the scenarios you run across. A few years ago, Alcamo and Ribeiro produced a very nice summary of what constitutes a scenario, and they identified 5 components which are always present. Stepwise changes, which is the portrayal or the description or somehow the story of the scenario evolves in steps from some initial situation to some final situation. Steps which are the inevitable result, or they're influenced, or they're shaped by the driving forces, the main factors or determinants which are pushing the characters, pushing the technology, pushing whatever it is we're describing in a certain direction. A base year, the scenario could be something that we expect to occur next year, it could be a few years from now, it could be 5-10 years in the future. The time horizon from the beginning to the end of the story that's captured in the scenario, and the storyline, a narrative story, a human story of human people trying to do something or encountering something or being engaged in something which has some beginning and some end, and there's some forces and constraints and characteristics which are shaping what is occurring in the scenario. In terms of scenario development, Cha, some years back, performed a very thorough review of how people have claim or describe their scenarios, how they developed them, what theories were available to back these up, the history of scenario usage. And Cha identified a set of steps, a set of movements from one set of information to another, which are these: set the boundary conditions. There will be some constraints, there will be some characteristics, there will be some elements affecting the interaction between our product, system, and service and whatever the public, the users, the stakeholders are trying to achieve. There'll be some key driving forces. There'll be physical forces of nature. There'll be psychological responses and reactions which are natural to people. There'll be sociological pressures about how we're perceived by others and what's considered appropriate in the context of the situation described by the scenario. Once these are identified, the constraints, the driving forces, we then move on to developing mini scenarios. Mini scenarios are short, sharp descriptions of a key interaction, possibly a key human response or a key emotion that's expected to emerge. So the mini scenarios are the points of contact. They're the things which are occurring between what we're designing and what the various stakeholders that we're looking at and considering what they might be reacting in that situation. The mini scenarios are trying to capture, to try and take photographs of distinct points in time in the story where we know there's something important. That characteristic, that interaction, that decision, pushing that button is important. So we try to capture that in mini scenarios, and then the mini scenarios are joined together to form a narrative story, a complete storyline, something from a beginning to an end in which some encounter or some usage or some deployment of the design, that the opportunity that we have in mind, is occurring with users or other stakeholders. In terms of scenario types, there tend to be at least two types of scenarios. The most commonly encountered, the one you'll probably run across the most on a daily basis, narrative scenarios. They're based on written text. They're short stories or vignettes, which are textual in nature. They use the power of words to convey the ideas, the emotions, to describe the interactions, to create empathy, to suggest possibilities. Then the other type is storyboard. Very common, growing in popularity these days. Storyboard, of course, has a lot of text usually involved, either written or spoken, but storyboards tend to be more graphical in nature. They tend to be sometimes in comic book format, or they're more visual. So we're combining in a storyboard scenario some text and some visuals, such that the stimulation and the creating of the empathy and the immersion that the story should help people to have in this interaction, so that they can discuss it, they can critique it, they can participate in co-design. The immersion is created and the memories are stimulated by both words and images. So whereas the human brain has different centers treating language and linguistics, or the visual cortex areas at the back, we're assuming it'll help to stimulate both, rather than just relying on the textual or the verbal stimulation of the person's imagination, empathy, and association and immersion in story. In terms of scenario types, we can also define scenarios not just about what they look like and how they're made, but we can talk about how they're used. And in terms of their usage patterns, there tend to be two large categories which are common. One is planning scenarios, and this is the type of thing we're very familiar with local government, NGOs, organizations, social settings. Planning scenarios tend to be stories about hypothetical future situations which are deployed to discuss how we can best meet those situations. So quite often they're based on facts and items of information that are fairly familiar, fairly reliable. Many people will be familiar with them and will be very confident in these items of information. And we're looking at how we can do things better when we get there. Design scenarios, slightly different. They tend to be a bit more specific, a more finely grained, more psychological in nature, more emphasis on interactions between the people and the product, system, or service that we're prospecting with our new opportunity, our new design. Design scenarios tend to be stories which focus on the people, the artifact, and what might occur in a given location, at a given point in time, as the interaction between them. The person's trying to achieve something, they're using our design, there's an outcome to that situation. And they're meant to be supports, to stimulate people, to interact with people, perform ethnography, perform co-design. It's about getting information, getting feedback, and trying to learn things which can help to improve our design. In terms of design scenarios, again, there'll be many terms for the different scenarios. Different businesses, different organizations will have preferred semantics that they'll use to describe them. But there are a few scenarios which you hear these terms for those scenarios repeated quite frequently. Some years back, Cooper, in his very well-known, very popular, and very influential book, described a couple of types of scenarios, and many businesses use these terms even today to describe the scenarios. One type, the most important type according to Cooper, is the daily use design scenario. Daily use and design scenarios are little stories, they're situations which capture a key interaction which is likely to occur regularly over the course of the day. So daily use scenarios are those main things, those key aspects of our design, those key interactions, which really must be right. They must be as frictionless as possible, as efficient as possible. They must stimulate positive responses from people as much as possible, because statistically, they're getting done over and over and over again very, very frequently. They're the most frequent interactions we anticipate for that particular design. An example of a daily use scenario might be the one shown here on this slide. This is a case of an automotive navigator, and the route planning system requires a confirmation at some point in the process. And it's a very simple daily use scenario, very trivial and elementary in nature, but already it captures the nature of the interaction, and it highlights the kinds of difficulties that might arise if we're not careful in the design of the interface. For example, it's from quick look at the scenario, thoughts of what would happen if it takes too long to ask the question, what would happen if it's difficult to find the confirmation button. There's a number of very obvious things in the scenario which a designer would be aware of and would zoom in on and try to consider and look at as part of the design process to try to make this interaction more efficient and more frictionless and less error prone due to the design of the interface. So as simple as it is, there's several things that come to mind, and that's exactly what the scenario is supposed to be doing, is bringing these thoughts to mind. The second type of scenario defined by Cooper was the necessary use design scenario. These are all those things that as designers, we hope that the user or the other stakeholders will never have to do. They're things which we wish were not necessary. They're things which are not central or core to the main function or the main meaning associated with the artifact we're designing. However, they're things that have to be doable if the situation arises. So if there is an accident, we have to be able to push the emergency button to call for help. There's many, many things. If the vehicle breaks down, we have to be able to repair it. There have to be certain things in place to make it repairable, etc., etc. So necessary use design scenarios, as defined by Cooper, are those critical key things which will be very rare, may never come into play at all, but yet we need scenarios, we need stories, we need to describe them, we need to work with people to make sure that these things are in place, they're efficient, they're safe, they're not prone to error. So necessary use design scenarios are things which there'll be a certain number of these we must consider. An example of a necessary use scenario might be this one here. A driver is forced into inconvenient, complex, uncomfortable maneuvers that might lead to minor scratches, damage, and so forth to the vehicle due to the actions of another driver. So this is a situation, typical situation, which as a designer, we hope the user never encounters. We wish the user would never encounter. Nevertheless, as the designers, we have the responsibility to ask the questions about what is the best design for the vehicle, what interfaces, what controls, what can we do to make it better when it does happen. So this is a typical necessary use scenario, one of many with complex machines. Another type of scenario, which is becoming more popular at the moment, is what's referred to as effective design scenario. Effective design scenarios are description stories about interactions between people and the opportunity we're designing, the artifact we're designing. They're interactions which will probably stimulate an emotional reaction from the people, from the users, either positive or negative. So affective scenarios are stories and descriptions which try to capture what might typically, in typical use, they might be a set of descriptions which capture, in some cases, the biggest positive emotional responses. In other cases, other scenarios might be more intended to try to stimulate and capture the negative or not desired responses from the people. And the point of affective design scenarios is that these days, so many of the artifacts we design are designed for reasons of experience, of value, of meaning. So when we're talking about the artifact itself having to provide a very positive experience and create meaning or facilitate meaning for its users, we shift a little bit the intention away from the physics of the artifact a little bit more to how people see it, how people think about how they interact. And effective design scenarios are useful ways of capturing what might be the bad reactions or the good reactions to the design proposals that we had in mind. And an example of an effective design scenario might be one like this one that's shown on the slide. Story about a father and a child, and they go for a first ride in their new car. There's a whole story here, a whole set of human emotions involved when a child and a father interact and perform some act together. This particular scenario, which may seem distant from the artifact itself, from the vehicle, raises questions of what could the vehicle do to facilitate this? What could the vehicle do to help document this, to take the photo, as it were, to remember it later on if it was a very positive experience? Maybe some way of helping to remember this or integrate this in some way into the family story might be something that's new and different, but it might be interesting to add to the vehicle. So quite often effective scenarios are looking at what kinds of emotional reactions, negative, might interfere with the interactions with the artifact, or what kind of emotions of a more positive nature might suggest additional capabilities, additional characteristics, adjustments to the characteristics and capabilities to blend them into people's lifestyle more smoothly and with less friction. And finally, one specific, very specific type of scenario is what was described by Mancini, design orientating scenarios. Mancini has over a number of years described what he defines as scenarios which have three fundamental components: a vision, a motivation, and a strategy. These scenarios are not so much about exploring something we wish to explore, either to make a planning decision or to improve the design by changing some of its characteristics or functions. These types of scenarios are complete, detailed visions of a possible future which could be achieved, and they're visions which are based on known facts, and a sort of plan or a connecting of the facts is put together to show the way forward. An example that illustrates this from the work of Mancini himself, his latest book title, Design Orientating Scenario. The book is a design orientating scenario. Livable proximity, the theory or the goal or the objective, the orientation of bringing services and bringing residences and businesses so close together that they're in a short physical distance, thus a short time travel distance, how this can improve people's lifestyles, how this can improve sustainability, a whole thesis, a whole articulation, a whole plan is laid out in this particular book under the title Livable Proximity to exemplify what can be done, to show the facts and to provide the justification for the design vision, to provide a roadmap, as it were, of how we can get there. So some scenarios are for exploring, some scenarios are for perhaps looking what could be different, what could be changed. And some scenarios, such as this particular category, are about laying out a vision doing it systematically, providing the background information such that they're not opinions, but there's many facts in this plan, and providing that vision or that story as a motivation or rally point for moving something forward. So that's a brief, short overview of some of the key specifically design characteristics of scenarios or considerations of scenarios. I hope that there was some useful observations and comments in this talk. And thank you for your time and patience with this. And I look forward to speaking with you again on the next occasion. Thank you so very much. Cheers.